Welcome back to another episode of the Intuition Activation Podcast. I'm Jessica Rachel, your host, a spiritual medium and intuitive coach, and I'm really excited to start diving into today's episode and the next few episodes over the next couple of weeks, because we are going to start touching on sort of the different ways that your spirit guides might actually be communicating with you, also known as the quote-unquote clairs. So last week we talked a lot about how to call on your guides, how to begin to cultivate a relationship with them, how to build up a good, healthy practice to call them in. And today we're really going to talk about how you might actually be receiving those messages and the ways that you specifically, or the unique way that you specifically might be receiving those messages. And so these are called the clairs, and we're going to dive into what all of that means over this episode in the next few weeks. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about my intuition activation mini course, because if you are loving everything that you've heard so far and you don't want to wait for another week for all of the information to come through, then I highly recommend that you sign up for or grab my intuition activation mini course. It is absolutely everything that you need in order to cultivate and create your intuitive practice to start channeling your spirit guides and start receiving real and clear answers from your guides today. It is a short, sweet, but very powerful little course where you will learn all of the information you need in order to start connecting with your spirit guides today. There is a deep meditation and activation to start turning on your intuitive abilities, and some really powerful exercises that you can use over and over again to start connecting with your spirit guides anytime that you want. And because the course is short and sweet, just think if you bought the course today, you could be channeling and receiving messages from your guides this time tomorrow. So there's no need to wait. You don't have to wait for the next episode to come out. Just grab the course. And just for my podcast listeners, I'm offering you a promo code. Use intuitive, all caps, for 10% off the course price. And then, of course, if you do not want to wait to learn how to do it yourself and you just want a session with me, then I'm offering a promo code for 15% off an intuitive guidance or spiritual guidance session with me. And you can use the same promo code intuition, all caps. So that's intuition, all caps, for 15% off a spiritual guidance session with me. So just head over to my website, jessicarachel.co/sessions to book a session, or jessicarachel.co/mini course in order to grab your mini course and get started on learning how to connect with your guides. I can't wait for you to dive into that and really just learn how to become an intuitive, how to connect with your guides and get the answers you need today in whichever way you decide to do that. Now, let's go on to today's episodes where we are talking all about the clairs. Now, for those of you who are thinking I'm crazy, what is the word clair? No, it is not just a really nice girl's name, which, by the way, it is. It's actually a prefix. It's actually a word. I believe it's derived from French. Don't get me wrong, if I stand corrected. That literally means clear, translates to clear. And so we put the word or the prefix clair in front of any of the senses to describe the way that you are connecting to your spirit guides. So, for example, if you are clairvoyant, you are a clear seer, right? Someone who can see clearly. If you are clairaudient, you are a clear hearer, someone who can hear clearly. And so we put clair in front of each of the senses. And if I am correct, I believe there are about 8 that we're going to talk about over the next few episodes. And, I'm not going to do a separate episode for each one of them. I'll put some of them together. But today, we're actually going to primarily, as you saw in the episode title, just focus on clairvoyance because it is one of the main ones. It's one of the big ones. And it's usually one of the ones that we really want to have access to get clear messages from our spirit guides. So we're also going to dive into not only how do you know if you're predominantly clairvoyant, but how to strengthen it even if you're not. So I'm excited for us to dive into all of that today. So before we do, I do want to say, before we kind of specifically talk about clairvoyance, I want to share that all of the clairs are accessible to you. Okay, they are all like muscles. We have all of the muscles in our body. The question is, which one of those muscles do you want to strengthen? Which of those muscles do you feel are going to be most helpful for you to connect to your guides? Now, that being said, especially when we're beginners or starting out, there is always one muscle or one clair that works a little bit better or a little bit easier for us. That doesn't mean that we don't have access to the other ones. You absolutely do. And you can cultivate all of them, as I feel that I have activated most of them over time. But usually when you're starting out, it's nice to know which of the ones is going to come through most easily. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about how you know if you might be predominantly clairvoyant. And even if you're not predominantly clairvoyant, how can you begin to strengthen that? So if you are predominantly clairvoyant, this might show up in the way that you approach sort of the way that you learn in life. So if you are a visual learner and you need to see things in order to understand, then you might be predominantly clairvoyant because your spirit guides are always trying to offer you messages in a way that you're going to understand it the most. So if you need to see things in order to understand it, then your guide is most likely going to try to offer you messages in that way. And so, if you're a visual learner, it's a pretty good sign that you might be clairvoyant. If you see colors when you meditate, so I know a lot of us here maybe listening are beginners, and if you're not a big meditator, then just ignore this one. But if you do meditate and you do start to kind of see colors come over you, you see different colors kind of behind your closed eyes when you're meditating, and maybe those shift over time, this is sort of the beginnings of a clairvoyant ability. And I know this was the case for me. I started to see colors and I started to wonder and notice them shifting. And so this one was a big sign for me that maybe it's a seeing thing. Okay. If you are somebody who looks for signs, so you look for angel numbers, maybe you see 1111 on the clock wherever you go, or 222, or 333, or 1234, right? All of those number patterns, and it feels like they show up no matter where you go. Or maybe you feel like when you need to ask for a sign or look for a sign in order to have confirmation that you're making the right decision in this moment. And maybe it shows up for you in the form of an animal totem, right? You see an animal when you ask for a sign, or a certain flower or a certain bird all of the time. And you see that as an indication that spirit is with you, that they are offering you a sign or confirmation from the universe that you're on the right path. So you're getting these visual cues all the time in your conscious waking life. Again, this might be an indication that you might be predominantly clairvoyant. Okay. Another sign that you might be clairvoyant, and this one is not true for me, even though I am predominantly clairvoyant, that is my strongest gift for sure. But it could be possible for you if you are a little bit more artistic. So you have a good eye, right? Maybe you're really good at making things visually or aesthetically pleasing. You like the way certain things look, and you're good at making things look good. This is definitely not the case for me. I do not thrive or in this category of making things look nice. I do not by any means call myself an artist. However, I do find that I can have a vision of something in my mind and picture it very clearly, and then be able to describe how I want it to manifest, so to speak. And so, if I'm thinking about, I don't know, decorating a bedroom, like maybe I couldn't do it from scratch, but I can sort of visualize, like, I want this piece of furniture, I want it to be this color, and I can get very specific about the visuals of certain things in my mind. I can dream it up, I can imagine it. That's a pretty good sign that you might be clairvoyant as well. The biggest one I would say as a good sign that you're a clairvoyant, or predominantly clairvoyant, I should say, is that you have a really vivid imagination. Now, this is something that might have shown up when you were a kid. Maybe it may have died down, or you may have suppressed it over time. But if you were the type of kid who was described as a daydreamer, or someone with a really rich inner world or a vivid imagination, chances are that you would probably be clairvoyant, because you can see so clearly in your mind the things that you're imagining, to the point where perhaps, and most likely, you had trouble distinguishing that from reality. right? And so if you were a kid who was really into make-believe, who was really into fantasy play, and who was just sort of always content to sort of be off in your own head, maybe you were so much so off in your own world that you kind of missed the conversations that were happening in front of you, right? You had such a rich inner world that sometimes you missed if somebody was even talking directly to you. They would have to call your name a few times before you kind of came back into the present moment. This is usually a sign that you are probably clairvoyant. And you see this a lot in kids. I can almost pick out a kid from a lineup if I feel like if they're predominantly clairvoyant, just based on the type of imaginary play that they have, right? If the imaginary play is really fantastical and kind of make believe, and it's kind of like all fairy tales and things that aren't real, so to speak, versus another kid whose imaginary play resembles a lot more of the reality that's in front of them, right? Like they need the play kitchen in order to pretend that they are cooking, right? Versus another kid who, could be alone in an empty room and sees a whole forest around them full of fairies, right? You get where I'm going here, right? It's an individual who can just dream it up and see it so clearly in their mind. And this is really the key to being clairvoyant, is that you can paint these pictures so easily in your mind and see it so clearly. And that's really what clairvoyance is and looks like when we're channeling it. It's very hard to distinguish it from our own imagination. So if you already have a really rich imagination and you can see things very clearly in your mind, then chances are clairvoyance is your clair, is the clair that works best for you. Another good way of telling if you can't really remember from your childhood, if you had a good imagination or not, or maybe it's worn off since then, think about when you're reading a book and when there's a descriptive paragraph kind of coming up. How clearly can you see that image in your mind's eye? Does it feel like when you're reading a book that you're watching a movie in your mind? Can you paint it so vividly? Are you sometimes disappointed when you see the movie and the movie that was created from the book and it looks nothing like you imagined in your head? It looked better in your own head, right? All the details were so kind of fleshed out in your own mind. That's a pretty good chance that, number one, you have a good imagination, and number two, you're predominantly clairvoyant. So think about that one. And so I want to talk a little bit about what does it look like when you are actually channeling. So if you are, whether you are predominantly clairvoyant or this is a skill that you're going to strengthen, a lot of us seem to get it wrong in the sense of what they expect clairvoyance to look like when they are calling in their guides or asking for messages from their guides. And so what I mean by this is a lot of us have the expectation that it's going to feel like an apparition is going to come up in front of us, and I'm going to see something as clearly as I can see my hand being held in front of my face, this thing that is separate of me. And it's not. It is no different than what you are visualizing in your mind and in your imagination. And as we talked about a lot in last week's episode, setting your intention is so important in channeling, and knowing so deeply that once you set the intention and ask for it, it is so. And why this is important when you're channeling is because if you know that I called in my guides in this moment, then anything that I am quote unquote imagining in this moment in my mind, I did not make up. I am channeling it. And so this is really one of the biggest barriers to trusting your intuitive abilities, is because you always tend to think, or people always tend to think, that they've made up the thing that they're imagining in that moment. But if you're imagining it in the context of having called in your guides and asking for a sign, it is not a coincidence that the image that comes to mind in that moment is a channeled image. And this is the only way that you're really able to distinguish whether you made it up or not, is in what context are you imagining this image. And I will say that the more that you learn to trust the images that come through, and the more you receive external confirmation that the information that you imagined in that moment was real or makes sense to somebody else or to you, the more you're going to learn to trust it and not always think that you're making it up. So unfortunately, I wish I could say that, that seeing something in your mind's eye is any different from your own thoughts or your own imagination in regular waking life. It's really not. It's really, am I receiving something in the context of having already called in my guides and asked for a question and learning to trust that image that comes through? I will give this one small exception, which is for some people, but not all, the images that do come through can often look like shimmery light or holographic. I know that this is the case for me, and that has been a big distinguishing factor for me of, is it my imagination or is it coming from spirit? And when it's coming from spirit, it tends to look like a shimmery holograph. The colors tend to be much more golden or sparkly and bright and light and sometimes even blinding. And so for me, that's a really big sort of clue or key that I'm channeling in that moment. But again, I know that when I've called in my guides, anything that comes through in that moment, and I'm asking from my guides directly, whether it's shimmery or not, I have to trust that I'm channeling it in that moment and trust what's coming through. So that's really, really key and really important. And I wish I could give you sort of more information. And I think people are sometimes even more almost disappointed to hear that it doesn't actually feel different than your imagination. But the beautiful thing about this is once you recognize what it feels like to channel or receive a message clairvoyantly, and then you realize that actually you've been doing this your whole life, right? These messages or images have always been coming to your mind's eye. You just never knew to trust it as anything but your own imagination. And once you start to realize that it is coming from your spirit guides and that it feels normal, it feels calm, it feels like something you've always been doing and that you're quite familiar with, it's an experience you've always been having. I mean, it's just such an indication of the fact that your intuitive abilities have always been there. And now we're just learning to recognize them and actually say that this is me channeling, right? Actually acknowledge that it was you channeling all along, that you were doing this your whole life, which is so beautiful. So now let's talk about if clairvoyance is not your strong suit, and even if it is, how can we begin to strengthen this ability, right? So even if you do think you are predominantly clairvoyant, sometimes we feel like it's not strong enough. And sometimes we feel like we want to receive more. And, at first, especially when we're starting out receiving messages through visuals or visual cues with our spirit guides, at first, sometimes it looks like only one image that comes through and flashes in your mind's eye. And then, as soon as you register it, it seems to like disappear just as quickly. And as you learn to develop this skill over time, it becomes multiple images or a string of images, and then eventually it feels almost like a movie, flashing across your mind and a moving picture, so to speak. And I will say that for me, even as an experienced medium, I still sometimes just get the one image because that one image is enough to interpret the message, to understand what the guide is saying. And over time, as you get more and more of the images that are the same, you and your guide or your spirit guide or the spirit or whatever spirit guides you are connecting with can start to cultivate or kind of create a personal dictionary for yourself, where every time I see this particular image, I know it's a message from my guide to do this. Right. So, the example I can give is for me, whenever my guide is trying to tell me that I need to take a break and relax, I always get the image of a bubble bath. And that's because for me, the image or the idea of relaxation feels like taking a nice warm hot bubble bath. And for somebody else, that image might be something different, right? Maybe their spirit guide will show them an image of a bed or an image of themselves sitting on, a beach somewhere in the sun. And so over time, you learn to sort of interpret or develop a sort of dictionary for what those specific images mean for you. Okay. But when you are trying to strengthen and reactivate and strengthen your gifts, the first thing you have to do is get your spirit guides involved. Ask them to help you do this. And so in last week's episode, we talked about creating our ritual. We call in our guides and then we set an intention. Well, one of our intentions can be to ask your guides to strengthen and reactivate our seeing gifts. So call upon your guides, spirits of the light. Are you here with me? Please help me reactivate and strengthen my clairvoyant or my seeing gifts. Don't forget to say this out loud. That makes a big difference, especially when we're beginners. And now your guide knows that they're going to help you do this. Now it's important to start to ask your guides to engage with you in a visual way. So you may start by asking your guide to send you a sign or a symbol in your mind's eye to let you know or to give you confirmation that they are with you or that you are in fact channeling in this moment. I know that I did this in my at the beginning of my journey. And if you go back to episode 1, I outlined 2 different examples of when this happened, right? The first time being that I saw the image of a lion in my mind and didn't know what it meant until a few days later, a little boy pointed out a lion figurine to me and didn't know why he needed me to see that. So we can ask our guides to sort of offer us a sign that we see in our mind and then sort of surrender and wait to see how it appears in our day-to-day life, in our waking life. And when it does appear, this acts as confirmation that the image that you did see in your mind really was a channeled image, which is really, really cool. Another example that I had for myself, right? I saw, the second clue that I had was I was asking my spirit guide a question. And I said, please give me confirmation that I'm supposed to go on this particular road trip that I had planned. And they showed me the image of an owl. And it wasn't, again, until I went on that trip that there were pictures of owls in every single Airbnb I stayed in. Again, acting as confirmation that number 1, I channeled in that moment. And number 2, my guides were letting me know that, yes, you should have taken that trip. So that's really cool. So think about asking your guides to show you a sign, see what comes up in your mind in that moment, trust the image regardless of what it is without any judgment, and then surrender and wait and see when does it show up in your waking life. And when you receive that confirmation, remember what it felt like to get that sign or that symbol in your mind and know that you can repeat this process and that you were channeling. So the other thing you can do is start to actually try and get a sense of what your spirit guide actually looks like. Now, this one's really fun, and I really want you to lean into your imagination when you do this. So you know that you've called your guide in because you called them in out loud. Now visualize in your mind that they are coming down and landing on the ground in front of you. What do you sense about them? What do you imagine that they look like in that moment? Conjure up an image in your mind. And yes, this is like playing make-believe. But again, in the context of calling in your guide, because you called them in, know that it is happening, and that because you're making it up, quote unquote, making it up in this moment, it is it is you channeling, it is your guide. And so trust the image that comes to mind when you see them. Do you see if your guide is male or female? Can you start to make out the texture or length or color of their hair? Can you imagine or dream up what their clothing might look like? Do you see if this guide looks like a person or maybe some sort of other fairy tale creature? Do they have angel wings or fairy wings or a tail or an alien head, right? What do you picture when they come through? Do you see a color around them? Maybe you imagine the color of their aura or the color of their energy that surrounds them. Remember, get creative, get excited about it. Build on your imagination skills. This is you channeling in that moment, and trust that what you are dreaming up in that moment is in fact what your guide looks like at that moment. And I will reiterate that, your guide can show up differently at different times. You may have different guides coming through. And so it can be different the next time. And this is just another opportunity to practice your clairvoyance once again and see, do they show up the same or do they show up differently? Both can act as confirmation for you. If the next time you go in and call your guides, you see the same thing or you imagine the same individual coming through, then perhaps it's confirmation that the thing you saw last time you channeled them was in fact real. So that's a really fun exercise to try. Another thing you can do is literally ask your guides a question, right? Remember, as I said in the last episode, that it's helpful, especially at first, to ask a question that you're not directly attached to the outcome of. So a question that there's no consequence to you, whether you like the answer or not, so to speak. What should I have for dinner tonight? What should my friend do about this? Something where you don't really care what the answer is, but you can start to see images that are going to offer you an answer, okay? And then you can start, and I do want to dissuade you from trying to interpret those images, especially when you're asking a question. A lot of the times we tend to put our own spin on what we think that image means, or we try to reach a little too far into making it very metaphorical. A lot of the times our guides are actually quite literal when they send us images. And so the best thing to do, instead of guessing, what does this image mean for me? Or what does this image actually mean? Am I trying to interpret the meaning of it? If you're unsure of what the image means and you can't think of the most literal sense of the word or the image, ask your guides to clarify for you, to either send a new image or please show you what they mean by that. And you can literally say out loud, Spirit Guide, please show me what you mean by this. And chances are they'll send you a new image to make it clearer for you. So for example, let's go back to the example of a bubble bath, right? My guide is trying to tell me to relax, and I'm seeing an image of a bubble bath. Now, I know for me, when I think bubble bath, I think relaxation. So initially, maybe I feel like I need to tell somebody if I see an image of a bubble bath that they need to relax. But I don't know if that's true for somebody else, especially if I'm channeling for another client. This is when I will ask the spirit guide to send a new image or to clarify for me, what does this image mean? What do you mean by that? Allow them to send another image my way. Now, if after I see this bubble bath, they then show me a series of other types of ways that they might relax or that I might interpret as relaxation, right? They send me a picture of a beach chair or them lounging on the beach. Then they send me a picture of them lying in bed, reading a book. Then, okay, I'm starting to get the message. The guide is trying to tell them that they need to do these types of things that are going to relax or allow them to relax. If the image I'm getting post the bubble bath image is then more layers to this bubble bath image. So now I see candles being lit around the bubble bath. I now see, these beautiful Epsom salts and essential oils being poured into the bath in the image. Well, now I know my guide is actually being quite literal, or whoever I'm channeling for his guide is being quite literal. And they feel very strongly that this individual actually needs to take a warm bubble bath instead of just relax and find a way to relax, right? So it's really important to sort of piece together the different images that come through and always ask for clarity when you're unsure, instead of having to play charades or trying to interpret it on your own or make too far of a reach of what that image means. And like I said, eventually you can start to create or cultivate sort of a personal dictionary with your guides so that when they send certain images, you know what they tend to mean by it. But never hesitate to ask for clarity. Never hesitate to ask them to send a new image if it doesn't mean anything to you or you are unclear on the meaning. And this is also what's really beautiful about channeling, is that you don't have to rely on your seeing gifts alone. So, it's important that even if clairvoyance is your most predominant gift, you do want to go ahead and try to develop some of the other clairs so that you're receiving a multi-sensory experience and messages from all around. And so if I were to get a bubble bath as an image, and then I could hear them say, relax, right? And then I could feel the warmth in my skin, right? That's a much clearer message than just the image of a bubble bath. And so, this is why it's so important not to get so hung up on which clair am I, because it's important to develop several of them and, or experience several of them in order to get a much bigger and broader understanding of what your guide is trying to say to you anyways. And that's why I think we'll probably in the next episode touch on clairaudience, because I feel that if you have at least those two coming through, you can get a pretty clear understanding of what your guide is trying to tell you. Images and words put together can give you a pretty clear message, and you really don't feel like you're playing charades just as much, which is really helpful, I think. The last thing I will say about developing your clairvoyance gifts is if you are calling them in and you really aren't getting any images coming through, you really feel like you're seeing nothing in your channeling session, then my guess is that you did not do enough prior to calling in your guides to allow you to drop in, to do the things you needed to do to get out of your head and into your body. You're too much in your head, you're too much in your thoughts, you're too much in your worrying or holding on to your expectation of what you think channeling through clairvoyance actually should look like, as opposed to what it actually does look like. And it actually does look like your imagination. And so if you really feel like you're not seeing, but you're imagining things in your mind, then get out of your own way and trust what's coming through in that moment. And if you find or you notice that nothing's coming through, you're just so blank in your head, then you haven't done enough to get out of your head. Go for a walk in nature, do some breath work, take a break, and then go ahead and try again another time. Remember that all of these gifts are skills that happen over time and with practice. Practice makes progress, especially when you're trying to channel. And the more that you practice it, the more that you receive confirmation, the more that you learn to trust your abilities as they come through and the images that are coming, the easier this gets over time. You should not feel exhausted and tired after trying to see one image from your spirit guides. And if this is the case, then you are gripping just a little too tight. You didn't do enough to drop in before you called your guides in. And that's really key. So if you haven't gone back to the to last week's episode or episode number 3 about how to do that and cultivate a good channeling practice, please make sure you go back and listen to that one. And that's everything I have to share about clairvoyance for today, and about strengthening your clairvoyance. So please give it a try. Maybe reach out to me on Instagram at I am Jessica Rachel. Let me know how it goes for you. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast, give it a 5-star review to help even more people find the show. And join me next week as we dive into connecting with your hearing gifts or your clairaudience. I can't wait to see you then. Bye.